The John Denver mystery is finally solved, and it isn't good. For decades, millions of fans have remembered John Denver as the gentle, nature-loving troubadour whose songs like Rocky Mountain High and Take Me Home, Country Roads defined an era of American music. His 1997 death in a plane crash seemed like a tragic accident, a beloved artist lost while pursuing his passion for flying. But the story we've been told about Denver's final flight omits crucial details that paint a far more troubling picture. Today, we're revealing the uncomfortable truths behind one of music's most sanitized tragedies, facts that challenge everything people thought they knew about Denver's last day. From a dangerously designed aircraft to battles with the FAA, from personal demons to possible intent, the real story of John Denver's fatal crash contains elements the mainstream media quickly brushed aside in favor of a cleaner, more comforting narrative. These are not just minor details lost to time. They are significant factors that completely reshape our understanding of how and why one of America's most beloved singers met his end on that October afternoon in 1997. What follows may forever change how you view John Denver's final journey. John Denver's death has long been portrayed as a simple tragedy, a talented pilot beset by sudden mechanical difficulties during a routine flight. But this account falls apart under close examination. The true story involves a complex interplay of questionable aircraft design, regulatory transgressions, personal darkness, and disturbing questions about Denver's state of mind in his final moments. When these pieces are considered together, a quite different portrait begins to emerge. One that points out the crash wasn't just random misfortune, but rather the result of a chain of increasingly reckless choices made by a man whose life had strayed very far from the all-American image his fans loved. These are the 5 critical elements of Denver's final flight, factors which have been consistently downplayed or ignored, and together help reveal what really happened over Monterey Bay on October 12, 1997. First, the plane he was flying should not have been aloft. When investigators recovered the wreckage from Monterey Bay, they quickly identified the model as a Rutan Long-EZ, an experimental, home-built aircraft Denver had purchased only weeks before. This was not a standard factory-assembled plane with rigorous safety testing, but a kit plane built by a former owner, one with unique handling quirks and operational challenges even seasoned pilots had to approach carefully. What made this aircraft particularly dangerous was a specific design modification that had catastrophic consequences. In most planes, the fuel selector valve is within easy reach of the pilot. In Denver's Long-EZ, it had been placed behind the pilot's left shoulder, requiring anyone flying the plane to twist their upper body almost completely backward to reach it. This was not a standard feature of the model, but a modification by the original builder, who had deviated from the official design. To switch fuel tanks in flight, Denver would have needed to remove one hand from the controls, twist his body, feel for a valve he could not see, and turn it all while trying to maintain control. Investigators concluded this dangerous modification likely played a central role in the crash. Denver took off with fuel in the right tank and appears to have run low shortly before the plane went down. His attempt to reach the awkwardly placed valve likely caused him to lose control, sending the aircraft into the fatal dive. The plane had even been inspected before he purchased it, yet this serious safety issue had not been flagged. For a pilot with Denver's history of difficulty maintaining focus and following safety protocols, this aircraft was a particularly unsafe match. It demanded precision and strict adherence to procedure, qualities his personal circumstances had weakened in the months before the crash. Second, he wasn't legally allowed to fly that day. One of the most shocking truths, barely acknowledged at the time, is that John Denver had no legal right to be in the cockpit. His medical certificate had been revoked by the FAA months earlier, effectively grounding him. This wasn't a paperwork issue. It followed repeated alcohol-related incidents, including multiple DUI arrests in 1993, 1994, and again in August 1997, just 2 months before the crash. The FAA strictly monitors alcohol-related offenses because they reveal judgment concerns that could affect safety in the air. Denver's history created a pattern regulators could not ignore. He had been explicitly warned not to operate any aircraft until he underwent evaluation and regained his medical certification. Yet on October 12, 1997, he ignored the suspension. He drove to the airport, prepared the aircraft, and took off, with no one checking his status. The aviation honor system, which relies on pilots to self-regulate, completely failed. His willingness to fly illegally reflected deeper issues in his decision-making. Investigators later found he had skipped essential pre-flight procedures, failed to confirm fuel levels, and had not reviewed the aircraft manual despite being unfamiliar with this model. Each oversight added another link to the chain of errors that led to the crash. For fans who saw him as thoughtful and responsible, this reality exposed a painful contradiction. The man known for singing about harmony and wisdom was privately making decisions that endangered himself and others. Third, he was fighting depression, divorce, and the collapse of his career. Behind Denver's public image of optimism and spiritual warmth, his personal life had been falling apart for years. By 1997, the gap between who he appeared to be and who he felt he had become had widened dramatically. His second marriage, to Cassandra Delaney, ended in a painful and very public divorce in 1991, something he later admitted devastated him emotionally. Financial strain followed, worsened by declining record sales. The artist who once dominated charts struggled to be relevant in a music world that moved on. His unique blend of folk and country was now often dismissed by younger audiences as old-fashioned. Friends said he felt forgotten and irrelevant, a harsh reality for someone who once filled stadiums and shaped popular culture. Financial concerns mounted as he sold properties and assets to keep up his lifestyle. Those close to him described signs of depression in his final months, withdrawal from friends, loss of interest in hobbies, and expressions of hopelessness about the future. He continued to work on projects for humanitarian and environmental causes, but those could not restore the kind of visibility that he once enjoyed. The public saw sunshine. He privately lived under dark clouds. All this emotional turmoil gives important context for his last flight. He was not the carefree mountain lover of his music, but a man beset by emotional isolation, career decline, financial pressure, and the loss of the adoration which had long sustained him. These struggles don't just make the story more tragic, but potentially change the meaning of the choices he made on his last day. 4. Some people don't think it was an accident at all. Of all the unsettling aspects of the John Denver mystery, perhaps the most unsettling are questions raised by those close to him about whether the crash was truly accidental. Although the official investigation by the NTSB concluded that the crash resulted from the awkwardly positioned fuel selector and Denver's probable loss of control while attempting to switch tanks, several details have turned up that make some consider something more deliberate might have been involved. The first red flag is the timing of Denver's final flight. Just weeks earlier, the FAA had formally denied him reinstatement of his medical certificate, a decision which for all practical purposes grounded him indefinitely. To a man who once called flying the second greatest thrill known to mankind, this loss would have been emotionally devastating, especially during a time when Denver was already mired in a very personal and professional crisis. Friends later said they were concerned about his mental state in the days leading up to the crash. One fellow pilot even claimed that Denver had made disturbing comments about flying being the only freedom he had left and questioned what the point of being careful was anymore. Those words, spoken just days before his fatal crash, have haunted the people who heard them. The manner of the flight itself further raised questions among aviation experts. Denver did not perform standard pre-flight checks, did not file a flight plan, and seemed to be flying without a clear destination or purpose. These behaviors were inconsistent with responsible piloting, but potentially consistent with someone in a reckless, despairing, or fatalistic state of mind. The decision to fly an experimental aircraft he barely knew, despite not being legally allowed to fly at all, pointed to a disregard for safety that some believe may have been intentional. One longtime associate suggested that Denver had lost control of many aspects of his life and perhaps, on that final day, lost control of the plane as well. While no definitive evidence supports the theory that Denver intended to crash, the combination of his emotional struggles, the FAA rejection, his increasingly reckless behavior, and the preventable nature of the accident left lingering questions the official report could not fully answer. These questions become even more thought-provoking when considering Denver's own lyrics, which often explored themes of escape, freedom, and rising above earthly burdens. Songs like Fly Away and Looking for Space take on new, haunting meaning in light of his final flight. While it would be irresponsible to claim the crash was intentional, it is also incomplete to ignore the possibility that Denver's mental state may have contributed to dangerous decisions that made the crash more likely or even unconsciously welcome. The truth of what he was thinking in those last moments over Monterey Bay may never be known, and that uncertainty deepens the tragedy of his loss. 5. The story was sanitized by the media. It's surprising how much the media cleaned up the story of John Denver, turning what happened to him into a narrative that was closer to his clean image than the complex reality of his final years. News from the beginning featured in the days after the crash focused on his music, his activism, and the poetry in a man who adored nature dying while flying over the California coast. While it was a tribute to the dead star, it missed out the troubling prelude leading up to the crash. His multiple DUI arrests, the suspension of his pilot's license, the decline of his career, the strain on his finances, and serious concerns over his emotional health were only briefly mentioned, if at all. Whenever such detail did make it into reports, it was buried deep in articles or squeezed into the end of broadcast segments. In this selective reporting, it wasn't quite a matter of not speaking ill of the dead. Rather, it was a tacit attempt at preserving the image their audience enjoyed instead of being faced by that complicated truth. According to one journalist, a peaceful version of events was sold to the public, when the reality was really messier. The sanitization continued in long-form media as well. Books and documentaries produced in the years after Denver's death often celebrated his achievements, but treated his final years and the circumstances of the crash as minor footnotes. Even coverage of the investigation tended to gloss over key details, such as the dangerous fuel selector placement, his lack of proper certification, and his failure to follow basic safety procedures. Instead, the crash was described vaguely as an unfortunate accident. By simplifying the narrative, the media not only distorted the public's understanding, but also missed an opportunity to discuss important issues like mental health, addiction, and the real consequences of reckless behavior. To those who grew up with Denver's gentle, nature-loving persona, the Fuller story doesn't diminish his musical brilliance or the comfort his songs continue to bring. Instead, it presents him as a complete person, someone whose struggles were as real as his successes, and whose demons ultimately played a role in his tragic end. All these 5 aspects of the John Denver mystery meshed together to form a clearer picture of what was most likely to have happened over Monterey Bay. Denver took off in an aircraft he was still learning to operate, without legal authorization, and without conducting proper pre-flight checks. Sometime later, he had to switch fuel tanks, which was a normal procedure, but, with the experimental aircraft, had been made much more hazardous by the poorly placed valve. In order to reach the valve, he would have had to twist himself in a cramped space, taking his attention away from the controls. This moment of divided focus, combined with emotional distress and a documented pattern of poor judgment, created the perfect conditions for a fatal loss of control. Whether this chain of events was purely accidental or influenced in some way by a state of mind is a question that may never be definitively answered. What is clear is that the crash was not the result of one simple mistake or an unpredictable mechanical failure, but a convergence of design flaws, regulatory oversights, personal struggles, and impaired judgment. John Denver's final flight holds a truth far more complex than the comforting story repeated for decades. There was a dangerous aircraft, a pilot flying illegally, and a series of deeply personal struggles, with questions of his intentions not yet put to rest. None of these things diminish the beauty of his music or the joy he gave to millions, but they complete the picture of the man behind the songs. His death was not a freak accident, but the culmination of many forces, human and mechanical, which happened to intersect at the worst moment in time. The full story may not be easy to hear, but it provides something far more valuable than a sanitized version of events. It provides the truth.